Disgusting animals like you belong in cages, not courthouses. Those words would echo in Officer Blake Morales's head for the rest of his career, however long that turned out to be. Judge Dana Walker approached the courthouse in plain clothes, a sleek briefcase packed with the morning's dockets. "Another hood rat trying to sneak in," Morales muttered as he stepped in front of her, blocking the stairs, looking down with open, simmering contempt. His open hand whipped across her face so hard her head snapped sideways. The briefcase slipped from her fingers, exploding open as case files scattered like confetti across the stone steps. Morales seized her by the throat and slammed her against the wall. "Creatures like you belong in cages, not in court," he hissed, twisting her arms behind her back while metal cuffs bit cruelly into her wrists. Around them, officers laughed, phones already up and recording. Dana's jaw throbbed, but her gaze stayed fixed on the bronze plaque above the entrance. The Honorable Judge D. Walker presiding. 20 feet from her own courtroom, the judge who had spent decades defending the Constitution now stood shackled and bruised, brutalized by the very machine she served. The sting on her cheek was nothing compared to the deeper wound, seeing just how eagerly the system devoured its own when it thought no one important was watching. Ever seen karma line up a knockout punch in real time? Inside the courthouse, Morales straightened his uniform, smoothing the wrinkles like he was erasing what had just happened. He'd done this routine more times than he could count. Rewrite the scene, rehearse the lies, cast himself as the steady hero facing chaos. The institution always believed cops over perps, especially when those perps looked like her. The script was worn smooth from overuse, and he knew every line. "Your Honor," Morales began, voice smooth and practiced, "I was carrying out routine security checks when I encountered a suspicious individual attempting to breach the courthouse perimeter." He nodded toward Dana, now seated at the defense table in a county jumpsuit, cuffs still on, an ugly purple bruise blooming across her cheek. The subject was behaving erratically, refused to provide identification, and became increasingly agitated when asked to comply with standard security procedures, he continued, sounding almost bored. The visiting judge, Harold Ellison, a thin, pale man pushing his late 60s, leaned forward, nodding with grave interest. "And what exactly did you observe, Officer Morales?" he asked. "Well, sir," Morales replied, "she was dressed inappropriately for court, carrying what appeared to be stolen legal documents." His eyes lit up as he settled into the performance. Each word came easier than the last as he layered on more fabrication, painting her as dangerous, unhinged, and out of place. "When I approached to investigate," he went on, "she became verbally aggressive, cursed at me, and made threats against law enforcement." In the gallery, Officers Ramirez and Thompson exchanged a quick look, the kind you only share with someone who's heard the same story way too many times. "She kept yelling that she was somebody important," Morales added, dripping disdain over each word. "These types always claim to be lawyers or judges or whatever, just to dodge accountability." "I've seen that move 100 times, Your Honor," Morales said, shaking his head like a disappointed parent. Judge Ellison steepled his fingers. "Did she attempt to flee or resist arrest?" "Absolutely," Morales replied without missing a beat. "The defendant became physically combative as I tried to place her in protective custody. I used only the minimal force needed to ensure everyone's safety." His hand trembled just enough to betray him as the court reporter hammered his lies into the record. From the back row, a young law clerk frowned, something tugging at the edge of her memory. "Officer Ramirez," the prosecutor called. "Can you corroborate Officer Morales' account?" Ramirez stood, uniform immaculate. "Yes, ma'am. I observed the incident from the entryway. The defendant was clearly trying to evade established security procedures. Officer Morales stayed calm and professional while she escalated the situation. His words were smooth, rehearsed, the kind that had been rewarded and believed 1,000 times before." "And the alleged assault?" Judge Ellison asked, brow furrowing as if this detail were a mere technicality. Morales' jaw flexed. "Your Honor, I used only the level of force necessary to restrain a hostile subject who posed a threat to courthouse security. Any injuries she sustained were a direct result of her resistance to lawful commands." He pulled out his phone and tapped a screen. "I have partial footage here," he added. "Unfortunately, my body cam malfunctioned this morning." The video he queued up started halfway through the encounter, conveniently omitting the initial slap and the chokehold on the steps. "How convenient," Dana muttered under her breath. Ellison's eyes flicked toward her. "Excuse me, Ms. Walker," he asked. "Nothing, Your Honor," she replied, voice controlled, though her eyes burned with a cold, focused fury. Morales, sensing he still owned the room, cleared his throat and shifted his stance like a man firmly convinced the game was already won. "What we're seeing," Morales continued, gesturing lazily toward the phone screen, "is yet another example of someone trying to play the victim after being caught breaking the law. She was trespassing on government property with questionable documents, and when called out, she immediately cried discrimination." At the prosecution table, Assistant District Attorney Karen Walsh, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and tired shoulders, nodded sympathetically. She'd heard this storyline before. It always sounded so reasonable on paper. "The Officer Morales," Walsh asked, "in your 17 years on the force, have you seen similar situations?" He drew himself up, voice swelling with practiced indignation. "Unfortunately, yes. There's a pattern. Some people think they're above the law, that the rules apply to everyone but them. When they're confronted with their own behavior, they start shouting about racism or bias to distract from their crimes." His tone suggested he was personally exhausted by the audacity of people like Dana Walker. "It's honestly insulting to individuals who experience real discrimination," he added, his voice ringing with moral outrage. Several spectators, mostly white courthouse staff, nodded along. They recognized this storyline from talk shows, news panels, and viral clips. It felt familiar, comfortable. "The defendant claims she was on her way to work," Morales said, throwing air quotes around the word. "But she couldn't produce valid ID, employment verification, or any legitimate reason to be wandering around a restricted area of the courthouse." Officer Thompson stepped forward. "If I may, Your Honor," he said, "the defendant was carrying what looked like confidential legal documents. Some of them had seals and numbers I've only seen on official files. We suspect she may be involved in identity theft or some kind of fraud ring." Judge Ellison's eyebrows lifted, intrigued. "A fraud scheme?" he repeated. Thompson nodded solemnly, while Morales jumped back in to capitalize on the opening, sensing his narrative tightening like a noose. "Yes, sir," Morales said smoothly. "The papers had judicial letterhead, case numbers, and sensitive information. No ordinary citizen has any business with materials like that. Our concern is that she was planning to impersonate court personnel or interfere with proceedings. The irony was thick enough to choke on, but Morales was oblivious. He was too busy stacking accusations on top of each other, completely unaware that every word he spoke was another nail in his own career's coffin. In my professional opinion, he concluded, this is just another example of someone trying to game the system. She knows if she spins this into a race issue, claims police brutality, she can muddy the waters and dodge responsibility for her actions. It's a calculated manipulation of public sympathy. He turned to stare directly at Dana, his eyes cold, a faint smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. He thought he was delivering the closing argument in a done deal. People like her think they can stroll into any building, any courtroom, any space they feel entitled to, Morales went on. And when someone finally tells them no, they scream discrimination and try to flip the script. Not here. Not in my courthouse. The words hung over the room like smog. Some staff shifted in their seats, uneasy, while others stayed rigid, unwilling to question the narrative that had always felt so safe and familiar. Your Honor, Ada Walsh added, turning back toward the bench, the state recommends we move forward with charges of trespassing, resisting arrest, and assault on a police officer. The defendant's attempt to reframe this as a civil rights complaint is clearly nothing more than a desperate defense tactic. Morales allowed himself a small, private smile. Another day, another arrest, another confirmation that the system worked exactly how it was designed, in his favor and against people like her. And furthermore, he said, emboldened by the nods surrounding him, I showed an exceptional level of restraint. The defendant appeared unstable, possibly under the influence. A less disciplined officer might have resorted to much greater force. Judge Ellison nodded gravely. Your professionalism is noted, Officer Morales. At the defense table, Dana sat perfectly still, hands folded despite the cuffs. Her expression was calm, almost serene, but the small upward curl at one corner of her mouth told another story. She was memorizing every lie, every embellishment, every word that would eventually burn Morales's career to the ground. He had no idea that the woman he dragged across the concrete was the one person in that building with the authority and resolve to dismantle him. Anything else you'd like to add, officer? Judge Ellison asked. Morales drew in a breath, puffing himself up one last time, eager to drive home the message he believed the courtroom needed to hear. Only this, Your Honor, Morales said, voice low and resolute. Incidents like this prove why strong law enforcement is essential. Some people only respond to authority when it's backed by force. The defendant learned today that actions have consequences. He had no idea how prophetic those words really were. Ada Walsh closed her file with a decisive snap. The state rests, Your Honor. The evidence clearly demonstrates a pattern of criminal behavior and defiance of lawful authority by the defendant. As Morales stepped down from the witness stand, he shot Dana one last smug look and winked, a little gesture meant to show total dominance, final victory. He didn't know it yet, but that wink would be the last triumphant moment of his entire career. The defendant may now address the court, Judge Ellison announced, his tone suggesting he expected little more than a brief, emotional outburst before he got on with the business of sentencing. Dana rose slowly, the cuffs clinking softly with each movement. The bruise on her cheek stood out starkly against her brown skin, and her normally immaculate clothes were slightly rumpled from the morning's violence. But there was something about the way she stood, back straight, shoulders squared, that radiated an authority no orange jumpsuit could dilute. A ripple of discomfort moved through the gallery. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying easily through the room. Her tone was clear, steady, and carried a kind of professional command more commonly heard from the bench than the defense table. Judge Ellison blinked, momentarily thrown. This wasn't the frantic pleading he'd expected. "I appreciate the opportunity to respond to these allegations," Dana continued. "First, I'd like to correct several factual inaccuracies in Officer Morales' testimony." Her eyes swept across the courtroom, briefly resting on every face that had nodded along with his story. "According to Officer Morales," she said, "I was trespassing on government property. In reality, I was walking along the public sidewalk, leading to the main courthouse entrance at approximately 8:47 a.m. She shifted slightly to face Ellison more directly. "Your Honor, I'm sure you're aware of Supreme Court precedent, including decisions recognizing that sidewalks adjacent to government buildings are traditional public forums where citizens have a constitutional right to be present," she said, her voice calm but precise. The court reporter's fingers froze for half a heartbeat before resuming their frantic rhythm. Ada Walsh's brow furrowed. This was not the rambling speech of someone unfamiliar with the law. "Additionally," Dana went on, "Officer Morales claimed I was carrying suspicious or stolen documents, implying I might be involved in identity theft. I'd like us to examine that suggestion carefully." She gestured toward the evidence table where her scattered papers had been gathered and clipped into a neat stack. "The documents in question are in fact legitimate legal files," she said. "They include pending case materials, judicial memoranda, and administrative correspondence." Her gaze hardened slightly. "All of which I am fully authorized to possess in my professional capacity." Judge Ellison narrowed his eyes. "And what exactly is your profession, Miss—" She let the pause stretch just long enough to make people lean forward. "Walker," she said. "Dr. Walker!" She smiled faintly. "We'll get to my background shortly, Your Honor." A chill skated down Morales' spine. Something about her confidence felt wrong, dangerous even. "If I may continue," Dana said, her voice taking on the measured cadence of someone used to dissecting testimony rather than giving it. "Officer Morales also claimed that I became verbally abusive and used profanity. I'll invoke my Fifth Amendment right regarding any specific statements I may or may not have made." She paused. "However, any such statements were made in response to an unprovoked physical assault." The young law clerk in the back straightened in her seat, eyes narrowing. She'd heard that voice somewhere before, issuing rulings, not defenses. "Now, about the alleged body cam malfunction," Donna continued, her tone cooling a few more degrees. "Your Honor, I'm sure you're familiar with the federal rules of evidence, particularly the provisions governing the use and preservation of electronic records." She lifted her chin slightly. "I have every reason to believe comprehensive video and audio recordings of this incident exist." Judge Ellison leaned forward. "What exactly are you referring to?" he asked. "This courthouse is covered by high-definition security cameras placed roughly every 15 feet along the main approach," Dana replied. "Additionally, the county maintains automatic backup systems for all officer body cam footage, regardless of any claimed malfunctions." The color drained from Morales's face. In his scramble to control the story, he'd conveniently forgotten about the fixed cameras staring down at the front steps all morning. "I am formally requesting," Dana said, "that this court issue a preservation order for all electronic surveillance from this morning between 8:45 and 9:15 a.m., including courthouse security videos, any body cam backup files, and any mobile recordings made by responding officers." Ada Walsh shot to her feet. "Objection, Your Honor. The defendant cannot start making evidentiary demands without counsel. This is highly irregular." Dana turned toward her with a look that made Walsh instinctively take half a step back. "Your Honor," Dana said evenly, "pro se defendants have a constitutional right under the Sixth Amendment to present evidence in their own defense. Furthermore, the prosecution has an obligation under Brady v. Maryland to preserve and disclose potentially exculpatory evidence." The silence that followed was thick enough to taste. This was not how these cases went. Usually, defendants like Dana cried, shouted, or went silent. They didn't cite landmark cases and procedural rules with the ease of someone who'd lived inside them. "Ms. Walker," Ellison said slowly, "you seem unusually knowledgeable about courtroom procedure. Do you have formal legal training?" "I have a bit of experience with the judicial system," Dana answered, keeping her tone deliberately neutral. Her eyes, however, flashed with something close to amusement. She took a few measured steps, limited by the cuffs, toward the evidence table. "I'd also like to address Officer Morales's claim that my presence here was suspicious or unauthorized," she said, gesturing toward the neatly stacked documents. "This," she continued, tapping a particular sheet, "is my daily court calendar. It shows that I was scheduled to appear in this building for official business beginning at 9:01 a.m. this morning." Bailiff Marcus Turner, a big man who'd worked in the courthouse for 14 years, went abruptly still. He stared at Dana, his eyes widening as recognition and dread crashed together. He'd seen that posture before. Except the woman had been in robes, not handcuffs. "Officer Morales testified that I claimed to be someone important," Dana said. "In fact, I never made such a statement. What I did attempt to do was show him my identification. Identification he refused to examine before attacking me." She let that sink in, sweeping the room with a level stare. "Your Honor, despite the violence and chaos this morning, I still have in my possession documentation that conclusively establishes both my identity and my legitimate business in this courthouse." "We was mitseasant?" Ellison cleared his throat. "What kind of documentation?" he asked, suddenly less certain than he had been 15 minutes earlier. Moving slowly, Dana reached into her jacket pocket, careful not to trigger any sudden reaction. "My judicial parking permit, issued by this courthouse's administrative office," she said. "My building access card, coded to open my chambers, and my official identification." Turner's stomach dropped. He'd seen all three, more times than he could count, in a very different context. "Your Honor," Dana said quietly, "I believe there's been a serious misunderstanding about exactly who Officer Morales assaulted this morning." She held up a leather credential wallet. Even from across the room, the gold judicial seal embossed on the front was unmistakable. The air seemed to leave the courtroom in a rush. "I suggest we recess briefly so that proper identification can be verified," she added in the unmistakable tone of someone who was used to giving orders in court, not taking them. Ellison's gaze bounced from the credential case to Dana's face, then to Bailiff Turner, who was nodding slowly, horror etched across his features. "Court will stand in recess for 15 minutes, Ellison said hoarsely, his gavel striking the sound block like a gunshot. As the courtroom emptied in a confused, buzzing swirl, Morales felt something inside him crack. Whatever game he thought he'd been playing, it was starting to dawn on him that he'd never understood the rules. In a small holding room off the main corridor, Dana sat calmly on a metal bench, while Turner fumbled with keys at the door, his hands shaking. "Judge Walker," he whispered at last, voice thick with shame. "Jesus, Judge Walker, I'm so sorry. I didn't recognize you out there, in regular clothes, and when they brought you in like that—" "It's all right, Mr. Turner," Dana said softly. "You weren't part of this. But I do need your help." "Anything, Your Honor," he said immediately. "Whatever you need." "I need you to go to my chambers quietly," Dana replied, "and bring me my robes, the black ones with the gold trim near the sleeves." "And Turner?" She waited until he met her eyes. "Bring my gavel too, the engraved one from my swearing-in ceremony." He nodded quickly, relief and terror warring on his face, then hurried out, leaving Dana alone with her thoughts and a rapidly narrowing window. She closed her eyes and inhaled deeply, centering herself the way she'd learned to do over 25 years on the bench. That morning, she'd woken up Judge Dana Walker, respected federal jurist, guardian of rights, a woman who still believed the system could be nudged toward fairness. In less than half an hour, she'd been reduced to a bruised defendant in shackles. Now, it was time to reverse the transformation and remind everyone exactly who she was. Her phone, confiscated during the arrest but now returned, buzzed relentlessly with missed calls and texts. Her clerk, Melissa Jordan, had sent message after message. "Judge Walker, where are you? The Peterson hearing is in 30 minutes. Your Honor, both sides are here and asking about you. Judge, please call me. Rumor are spreading something happened." Dana typed quickly, "Tell counsel in Peterson we'll reschedule. Clear my afternoon calendar." A more urgent matter just landed on the docket. She scrolled to a familiar contact, Chief Judge Elaine Porter, administrative head of the district. "Elaine, it's Dana," she said when the line clicked. "Dana, thank God," Porter answered. "We heard something happened at the courthouse. Are you okay?" "I've been better," Dana said dryly. "I need you to do a few things for me, and I need you to do them without asking too many questions, at least for the next 5 minutes. Porter didn't hesitate. "Of course, name it." "First," Dana said, "call courthouse security and order immediate preservation and duplication of all surveillance footage from 8:45 to 9:15 this morning. Every camera, every angle. Then make sure multiple copies are stored in separate locations." There was a pause. "Dana, what on earth happened?" Porter asked quietly. "A police officer named Morales just spent an hour on the stand bragging about how he bravely subdued a dangerous criminal trespassing at the courthouse," Dana replied. "That criminal was me." Porter was silent for almost 30 seconds. "Good God," she finally breathed. Are you?" "He slapped me, choked me, put me in cuffs on the front steps," Dana said, flatly. "Called me a filthy animal and said I belonged in a cage." Another beat of silence. "Do you want me to call the U.S. Attorney? The FBI? The State Attorney General?" Porter asked. "Not yet," Dana answered. "Right now, I need evidence secured, and I need a record sweep. I want every case. Morales has testified and over the past 5 years, pulled and reviewed," Dana said. "Every single one." "Consider it done," reporter replied, steel edging into her tone. But Dana, you know you can't preside over this matter yourself. Conflict of interest doesn't even begin to cover it. Dana allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Elaine, in about 10 minutes, I'm walking back into that courtroom in full robes. Morales is going to learn exactly who he laid hands on. More importantly, she added, he's going to find out who has the authority to ensure he finally faces consequences. Turner slipped back into the room carrying a garment bag and a small wooden box. Your robes, Your Honor, he said, still a little breathless. And your gavel. Dana stood, unzipping the garment bag. The familiar black fabric spilled out, the gold trim at the cuffs glinting faintly under the fluorescent lights. She slid her arms into the sleeves like armor. As the robe settled over her shoulders, she felt the transformation complete itself. The weight of the fabric reminded her of every oath she'd taken, every ruling she'd signed, every time she'd tried, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, to bend the system toward justice. She opened the wooden box and lifted out her ceremonial gavel, its smooth handle worn to her grip. Etched along the side were 4 words, Justice is blind, but she sees. The familiar weight steadied her hand in her resolve. Mr. Turner, she said, adjusting the collar of her robe, when we walk back into that courtroom, I want you to announce me properly. Yes, Your Honor, he replied. How would you like to be announced? Dana drew herself to her full height, every inch the judge she had been for decades. The Honorable Judge, Dana Walker presiding, she said. She caught her reflection in a small mirror, the bruise on her cheek still dark, now less an injury than a statement. It was no longer just evidence of Morales's brutality. It was a visible indictment of a system that had let someone like him operate unchecked, and it was a promise of what would come next. When court resumes, she murmured, more to herself than to Turner, Officer Morales is going to find out what justice really looks like. Turner nodded, throat tight. Together they stepped into the hallway. The sounds of the courthouse suddenly sharper, the stakes higher than ever. All rise! Turner's voice thundered through the courtroom, carrying an authority that snapped every spine straight. What followed would burn itself into the memory of everyone present. Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Dana Walker presiding. The words hit the room like a lightning strike, and at the prosecution table, Morales, who'd been leaning back with casual confidence, went rigid. Judge Ellison, still seated at the bench, realized a second too late that he was in the wrong chair. Ada Walsh's mouth fell open. The door to the judge's chambers swung wide, and Dana entered, cloaked in her full judicial robes, the gold trim catching the overhead lights like fire. In her right hand, she carried the engraved gavel. The room was dead silent, no shuffling, no whispers, just the hum of the vents and the collective realization that they had misread the entire morning. Dana moved with measured, deliberate steps toward the bench that had always been hers. She settled into her chair behind the elevated desk, her bench, and let the silence stretch just long enough to become uncomfortable. Her eyes swept across the room, taking in every stunned expression, every dropped jaw, every person now scrambling mentally to rewrite the narrative they'd embraced so easily. Officer Morales, she said quietly, her voice amplified by the microphone and by something deeper. You may remain standing. Morales looked like he might throw up. The color had drained from his face. Your Honor, Judge Walker, we didn't know, Ellison stammered, half rising. Judge Ellison, Dana said, cutting him off without malice. Thank you for handling my docket during my unexpected delay. You may return to your own courtroom. I'll take it from here. He didn't need to be told twice. Ellison practically bolted from the bench, his robes flaring behind him as though the very air were pushing him out. Dana turned back to Morales, who was visibly trembling now. Officer Morales, she said, her tone cool and surgical. Approximately 2 hours ago, you gave sworn testimony in this courtroom. Do you recall that? He couldn't seem to form a complete sentence. Let me help you, Dana said. You stated, and I quote, these people always claim to be lawyers, judges, senators, anything to dodge accountability. Do you remember saying that? He managed the smallest nod. You also described me as another entitled activist looking for a payday, correct? The room was so quiet that the air conditioning sounded like a storm. And most memorably, Dana continued, her voice turning colder still, you said that people like me need to learn that actions have consequences. Do you recall offering that advice to this court? Morales's legs shook so violently he had to lock his knees to stay upright. Dana reached beneath the bench and lifted a tablet onto the surface. Officer Morales, I'd like to show you something that's just come to light. She turned the tablet so the screen faced the courtroom. This is security footage from Courthouse Camera 7, she said, which has a clear view of the main entrance. Her fingertip brushed the screen, and the video came alive. The entire room watched as the scene unfolded in crisp high definition. Dana walking up the steps in her civilian clothes, briefcase in hand, moving with the calm, efficient stride of someone who belonged there. That is, until Morales stepped into her path. The audio fed through the courtroom speakers, clear and undeniable. Look at that! Another hood rat trying to slip in, Morales's own voice sneered from the recording. Several people in the gallery gasped, some clapping hands over their mouths. On screen, they saw Morales's hand lash out, striking Dana hard enough to twist her head sideways. They watched him grab her by the throat, drive her into the wall, then wrench her arms behind her back to cuff her. On the tablet, the whole assault played out from multiple angles as the camera view switched. No shaky phone footage, no convenient obstruction, just brutal clarity. On one angle, another officer could clearly be seen lifting his phone to record, laughing. On another, papers from Dana's briefcase fluttered across the steps while bystanders did nothing. Morales's version of events evaporated in real time. The gap between his testimony and the video was a canyon no one in that room could ignore. Morales's voice, captured without distortion, echoed again. Trash like you belongs in a cage. The room recoiled. Ada Walsh looked physically ill. Turner stood ramrod straight, jaw clenched. The officers who had laughed before now stared at the floor or the far wall, anywhere but the bench. The footage kept rolling, documenting every second Morales had conveniently skipped over. It was all there, the slap, the choke, the metal cuffs, the casual cruelty that had once seemed safe behind a badge. The silence in the courtroom deepened into something heavy, almost suffocating. For the first time that morning, Morales looked genuinely small in his uniform, less like a hero and more like a man caught under a spotlight with nowhere to run. Dana let the video continue, saying nothing, letting his own actions speak louder than any argument she could make. The worst part, everyone knew instinctively, hadn't even arrived yet. The footage was still moving toward its most devastating moments. On screen, Dana's body jerked as he shoved her against the stone wall, the sound of impact picked up cruelly by the microphones outside. A close-up angle showed the shock in her eyes as the slap landed, a shock that quickly hardened into something colder, more dangerous. The recording cut between angles, capturing Morales' face twisted in contempt, the other officers laughing, no one stepping in. The courtroom watched, transfixed, as the narrative they'd so readily accepted came apart at the seams. The video zoomed out to show the full scene, the judge of the court, though no one had recognized her as such, pinned and cuffed a few yards from her own nameplate on the wall. The woman Morales had called an animal stood there now at the bench, robed and resolute, forcing everyone to confront what they had allowed themselves to believe. Yet, as damning as the footage already was, the recording still hadn't revealed the most devastating evidence of all. Every time Morales had sneered about these people, every time he'd painted her as unstable, aggressive, dangerous, it all unraveled against the stark, indifferent honesty of the camera. The angles, the timestamps, the audio, the body language, all of it told a story utterly incompatible with his testimony. The courtroom had to sit with that discomfort, the realization that they'd nearly rushed to punish a woman whose only crime had been trying to walk into the building where she worked. On the screen, Dana never once raised a hand against Morales. She never lunged, never swung, never did any of the things he so confidently described under oath. What she did, caught clearly by the camera, was reach into her pocket for her ID, only to have her arm grabbed and twisted behind her back before she could even open the wallet. The audience watched the moment where the truth split from his story, a single movement that demolished his entire narrative. Someone in the gallery let out a choked curse. Another person muttered, "Oh my God," under their breath. The officers who'd testified in support of Morales stared at the floor, their earlier confidence evaporating. The footage didn't just show one bad decision or a momentary lapse of judgment. It exposed a practiced pattern, a casual brutality delivered with the certainty that no one important would ever see the whole thing. Everyone now understood just how wrong that assumption had been. Dana watched Morales closely as his own voice continued to pour through the speakers. No longer a weapon, but evidence. Each slur, each false claim, each smug remark landed with the weight of an indictment. On screen, his hands slammed the cuffs shut around her wrists. In the courtroom, his actual hands shook at his sides. The recording rolled on, unflinching, dragging every second of that morning into the light where excuses and spin had no place left to hide. "This," Dana said quietly, her eyes never leaving at Morales, "is the reality behind your sworn testimony." On the tablet, the camera angle shifted again, showing the front steps from above. There she was, calm and composed, simply trying to enter the courthouse. There he was, stepping into her path, spitting out, "Look at that. Another street rat, trying to sneak in." The words echoed through the courtroom, poisonous and undeniable, impossible to dress up as anything but what they were. Morales' voice filled the room, loud and crystal clear from the tablet speakers. Several people gasped, some flinched, as if they could somehow dodge the ugliness of what they were hearing. The video kept playing, displaying his unprovoked attack in unforgiving detail. The slap that snapped Dana's head to the side, the hand clamping around her throat, the cuffs closing around her wrist. The recording marched inexorably forward, and everyone watching knew. The most devastating moment was still on its way. Vile animals like you belong in cages, not courtrooms. Officer Blake Morales' own words, dripping with hatred, boomed through his courtroom from the tablet speakers. A few attorneys and jurors waiting on other matters quietly rose and slipped out, faces twisted in disgust. "Officer Morales," Judge Dana Walker said, pausing the footage, "do you see any verbal aggression from the defendant here? Any cursing? Any threats at all?" Morales stayed mute, watching his career crumble in real time. He looked like a man watching his badge melt off his chest. "Now," Dana went on, voice cool and precise, "let's revisit your claim that your body camera conveniently malfunctioned." She swiped to another file. "This is backup footage from your own body cam, automatically uploaded to the county's secure cloud every 60 seconds, a system you apparently forgot existed or hoped the rest of us didn't know about." A new video window opened and the room tensed. The fresh recording started, this time uncut. Morales' voice snarled from the speakers, even uglier in context. "Look at this uppity one thinking she can just stroll into my courthouse," he barked. "People like her need to remember their place. Guess I'll remind her." Ada Karen Walsh was stuffing papers into her briefcase with shaking hands, desperate to separate herself from the disaster unfolding. But Dana wasn't done. "Officer Ramirez, Officer Thompson," she called, "care to amend your testimony?" Both officers were already inching toward the exit, like they might somehow slip out of frame. "And here," Dana continued, scrubbing forward until Morales' gloved hand shot toward the camera, "we see the precise moment Officer Morales commits felony assault against a sitting federal judge." She let the designation hang in the air. Federal judge. Morales' knees wobbled. He grabbed the prosecution table for balance, the word felony echoing louder than anything he'd said all morning. "But we're not finished," Dana said, her tone almost casual now, which somehow made it worse. She tapped another icon on the tablet. "This is audio from Officer Thompson's body cam, which, interestingly enough, had no technical issues whatsoever." A new clip began. Thompson's voice came through, chatting with Ramirez while Morales assaulted her outside. "Man, he's really going off on this one. Thinks she's actually somebody important like she keeps claiming?" Thompson sounded more amused than concerned. Ramirez's reply followed, lazy and dismissive. "Please, look at her. Morales knows exactly who he's dealing with. Probably some welfare queen trying to hustle the system again." In the background, they all laughed while Dana's body hit the wall on video. The few remaining spectators stared at Morales like he was something poisonous. "Officer Morales," Dana said, setting the tablet down, "earlier you demanded employment verification from me." She gestured to the massive judicial seal mounted behind her bench. "Allow me to provide it." She pointed next to the engraved nameplate reading, "The Honorable Judge D. Walker," then toward the oil portrait of her hanging in the lobby, visible through an open doorway. "I've been the chief judge of this courthouse for 25 years, Officer Morales. Every warrant you've ever requested, every search you've ever conducted under this jurisdiction, every case where you've testified, directly or indirectly, has passed across my desk and fallen under my authority." Morales finally found his voice, though it emerged as a broken whisper. "Your Honor, I didn't know." "Didn't know," Dana repeated slowly. "You didn't know because you didn't bother to look. You saw a black woman in street clothes, and that was enough. You decided she was worthless, powerless, disposable. You chose violence because you believed there would be no consequences." She leaned in slightly. But there's something else you were unaware of, Officer Morales. The room froze. For the last 6 months, Dana said, I've been coordinating an investigation into patterns of misconduct and racial bias within this police department, working directly with the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice and the FBI. Whatever color remained in Morales's face drained away. This morning was not random, she continued. You've been on our radar for quite some time. Today, you just gifted us with the clearest evidence any investigator could ask for. She lifted her gavel, holding it upright between her fingers. You told this courtroom earlier that people like me need to understand that actions have consequences. Her gaze never left him. On that point, Officer Morales, you were absolutely correct. She raised the gavel. Court will recess while I determine the appropriate charges and next steps. The gavel struck with a crack like a gunshot. Morales collapsed into a chair, everything he valued now hanging by a thread. 20 minutes later, when court reconvened, the atmosphere was unrecognizable. Word had raced through the building like electricity. Attorneys, clerks, deputies, and reporters slipped into the gallery until every seat was filled and the walls were lined. This was the kind of reversal people would talk about for decades. Morales now sat at what was unmistakably the defendant's table, his uniform wrinkled, tie askew, skin the color of old paper. His hastily appointed public defender, Daniel Harper, looked overwhelmed. Judge Dana Walker returned to the bench with the measured composure she'd honed over a quarter-century. Yet now, every person in the room saw her through a different lens. Not just as a judge, but as the woman whose face had just been slammed into her own courthouse wall. Officer Morales, she began, voice steady but iron-hard. Before we address the substantial criminal charges you now face, I believe this court deserves to fully understand exactly who you attacked today. She rose from her chair and stepped out from behind the bench, facing the crowd directly. My name is Judge Dana Walker. I have served as the presiding judge of this courthouse for 25 years. I was appointed by Governor Reynolds in 1999 and confirmed unanimously by our state senate. Her tone sharpened. In other words, Officer Morales, this courtroom, this bench, this building, they aren't just where I work. They are my responsibility, my jurisdiction, my home turf. I graduated magna cum laude from Harvard Law School, she continued, where I served as an editor on the Harvard Law Review. Before accepting this appointment, I spent nearly a decade as a federal prosecutor in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. She glanced briefly toward Morales's attorney, who was already scribbling furiously. My specialty was prosecuting police misconduct, civil rights violations, and institutional racism. I successfully tried 47 cases against officers who abused their authority. Yakit Sekiliars and Hais Sanowan. In my 25 years on this bench, Dana said, I've presided over well over 16,000 cases. I've sentenced everyone from low-level offenders to convicted murderers. I've listened to every kind of excuse, justification, and sob story you can imagine. She walked closer to the defense table, stopping just a few feet from Morales. And yet, in all that time, I have never seen such a pure, unfiltered example of everything broken about modern policing as I saw this morning. The room was so quiet, the hum of the lights seemed loud. When you called me a hood rat and an animal, Donna went on. When you told me I belonged in a cage. When you bounced my head off the stone outside this building. You weren't just attacking some random passerby. She returned to her bench, robe whispering around her. You assaulted the person this community depends on to hold officers like you accountable when they cross the line. Dana opened a thick folder that had been placed neatly on the bench. This file, she said, contains the record of every case you've testified in for the last 5 years. She flipped a few pages. 43 cases, Officer Morales. That's 43 times you stood in this courtroom, raised your right hand, and swore to tell the truth. The pages rasped as she turned them. In 28 of those, the defendants were people of color. In 26, you were the arresting officer. And in nearly all of those cases, Dana continued, you described the accused using almost identical language to what you used for me this morning. She read from the file, acting erratically, refusing to comply, becoming aggressive, endangering officer safety. The same script, again and again. She snapped the folder closed. You didn't just tell a story today, Officer Morales. You revealed a pattern. A pattern this court and this community can no longer afford to ignore or excuse. But here's the part you never saw coming, Dana said, picking up a second binder. For months, I've been collaborating with the FBI, the State Attorney General's Office, and the Department of Justice, reviewing misconduct allegations and use of force reports from this department. She looked straight at him. Your name came up repeatedly, enough that it was flagged on a federal watch list. Morales's public defender stopped writing and simply stared at his client, an expression of stunned pity washing over his face. You have been under federal scrutiny, Officer Morales, Dana said. Your phone and email metadata have been monitored. Your stops, arrests, and complaint history have been analyzed for patterns. Investigators have quietly re-interviewed several of your past arrestees. She leaned forward. And this morning, on the front steps of this courthouse, you handed those investigators the one thing they hadn't yet obtained: crystal clear, unambiguous, recorded proof of criminal civil rights violations committed under color of law. Dana raised her gavel again, holding it level with her eyes. You assaulted a federal judge in the course of her official duties, she said. You did so while making explicitly racist statements, captured on multiple devices. You then took the stand and lied under oath about every key fact. The gavel hovered. Earlier today, you asked if I knew my place. Her voice dropped, low and deadly calm. Allow me to demonstrate exactly what my place is, Officer Morales. My place is on this bench, in this courtroom, ensuring that justice is done, Dana said. My place is holding individuals like you responsible when you exploit the power we loaned you to harm the people you were sworn to protect. She set the gavel down for a moment and opened a new manila folder. Let's take a look at your distinguished career in law enforcement, shall we? Morales's shoulders slumped, as if someone had finally cut the strings holding him up. According to internal affairs records, Dana said, you've been the subject of 47 formal complaints in your 15-year career. 47, she shook her head. That's more than 3 complaints a year. She lifted the first document. Complaint number 1, filed in 2008. Ms. Rita Delgado, a 67-year-old grandmother, alleged that during a basic traffic stop, you called her a racial slur and slammed her face onto her car hood when she dared ask for your badge number. The gallery shifted uneasily. Your department ruled Ms. Delgado's claims unsubstantiated, Dana continued. Curious, given that we now have video of you using almost identical language and tactics on me." She pulled another sheet. Complaint 12, 2011. Jared Washington, a 19-year-old honor student, reported that you planted narcotics in his backpack after he refused to inform on his brother. Internal Affairs again labeled the complaint unsubstantiated. Mr. Washington's record, however, still shows the arrest you orchestrated. Complaint 23, 2015, Dana went on. Dr. Marcus Johnson, a respected cardiologist, claimed you arrested him in front of his own house because you didn't believe a black man could live in that neighborhood. Dr. Johnson spent 6 hours in a holding cell before his attorney secured his release. She glanced down at the file. Officer Morales, do you recall how Internal Affairs resolved that complaint? Morales' voice was barely audible. I don't remember. Let me assist you, Dana said. It was also deemed unsubstantiated. See a pattern forming? In the front row, Chief Judge Elaine Porter sat stone-faced, taking notes. But that's not the only pattern, Dana continued. She set aside the complaints and pulled out a large laminated chart, propping it on an easel where the whole room could see. Colored bars and percentages jumped from the board like a visual indictment of his entire career. Over 15 years, you've made approximately 1,200 arrests, Dana said, indicating the chart with a laser pointer. Of those, 1,046, roughly 87%, involved people of color. Yet your patrol area is 42% white, 31% Latino, and 27% black. She tapped another statistic. Even more revealing, your own reports show that you used physical force in 63% of arrests involving people of color, compared with only 12% involving white suspects. And perhaps most damning, she continued, of those 1,046 arrests of people of color, 432 cases were dismissed, many for lack of evidence, prosecutorial concerns, or clear constitutional violations. She lowered the pointer. That's nearly a 40% dismissal rate. Do you know what we call it when an officer's arrests are thrown out at that rate for constitutional problems, Officer Morales? She didn't wait for an answer. We call it a pattern of criminal conduct. The only sound in the room was the soft scratch of reporters' pens racing across paper. And yes, there's more, Dana said, her tone almost conversational. I've also reviewed the financial toll your behavior has taken on this community. She lifted another document. Over the last 15 years, this county has paid out approximately $2.3 million in settlements and judgments connected directly to your conduct. She met his eyes. $2.3 million pulled from taxpayers' pockets. Morales finally croaked, "Your Honor, I was just doing my job." Dana's expression hardened. "Your job," she repeated. "Let's revisit the job description you swore to uphold." She picked up a copy of his oath of office and read, "I solemnly swear to support and defend the Constitution of the United States and this state, and to faithfully and impartially execute the duties of my office to the best of my ability." She set the paper down deliberately. "Faithfully and impartially, Officer Morales," Dana said. "Not selectively, not based on race, not according to your personal prejudices or ego." She stepped away from the bench again, addressing the entire courtroom. "What we're looking at here is not just one corrupt cop gone rogue. This is what happens when a system repeatedly shields officers like Morales, dismissing complaints, paying settlements, and calling everything unsubstantiated, while the abuse continues unchecked. She turned back to him, eyes uncompromising. But that same system failed you today, didn't it? She said. Because today, you chose to brutalize someone with the authority and the will to drag all of this into the light. Morales dropped his head into his hands, fingers digging into his scalp. You spent this morning lecturing me about knowing my place, Dana said. I think it's time you learned yours. She returned to her bench, robe swirling, and lifted the gavel as the courtroom held its breath. Your place, Officer Morales, Dana said, is no longer behind a badge. Your place is in that chair as a criminal defendant, facing the full consequences of 15 years of unlawful conduct. The gavel cracked against the block with finality. The message was unmistakable. His days as an untouchable enforcer were over. Now he was just another defendant waiting to hear how badly he'd broken his own life, and how long the system he'd abused would hold him accountable. Dana stood tall behind the bench, black robes hanging around her like armor forged from hard years and harder decisions. The entire courtroom seemed to lean toward her, waiting. Before I issue formal judgment, she began, voice calm but resonant, I want to address not only you, Officer Morales, but everyone in this room, and everyone who will eventually hear about what happened here today. The TV cameras in the back focused in, red lights blinking steadily. This morning began with a simple, dangerous question, Dana said. What happens when a man with a badge becomes convinced he's untouchable? When years of unchecked power and institutional protection convince him he can assault a federal judge on the courthouse steps and stroll into this room expecting to walk back out a hero? Morales sat slumped at the defense table, staring at some invisible point on the floor as his world dissolved around him in slow motion. The answer, Officer Morales, Dana continued, is standing right in front of you. She picked up her engraved gavel, the one inscribed with "Justice is blind, but she sees." For 15 years, you've terrorized this community, pulling over drivers for imaginary infractions, throwing young men against walls, treating entire neighborhoods like enemy territory. For 15 years, you've trampled the rights of people whose only crime was existing while black or brown in your presence. Her words hit like body blows. For 15 years, she went on, you've made a mockery of the oath you swore and the badge you wore, turning authority into a weapon instead of a responsibility. Her gaze didn't waver, but your worst mistake wasn't any single act of brutality. Your worst mistake was believing the system would always catch you when you fell, shield you no matter how far you pushed it, no matter how many lives you shattered. Morales finally raised his eyes, red-rimmed and defeated. This morning, Dana said quietly, when you called me a filthy animal and told me I belonged in a cage, when you drove my head into the wall of my own courthouse, slapped cuffs on me, and paraded me through these halls like a criminal, you thought you were asserting dominance over just another powerless target. She leaned forward, voice dropping. You were wrong. I was never powerless, Officer Morales. And neither were the people you brutalized. They just lacked witnesses and leverage. She straightened again, letting the silence stretch. Today, justice finally had both. Dana looked down at the file, then back at Morales. Based on the overwhelming evidence presented, nearly all of it coming from your own mouth, your own camera, and your own hands, I find you guilty of assault in the first degree, a felony offense. The words rolled through the courtroom like thunder. Morales' attorney closed his notebook and pressed his lips together, knowing appeals would be an uphill battle. I further find you guilty, Dana continued, of assault on a judicial officer, a federal felony carrying a mandatory minimum term of 5 years imprisonment. Murmurs rippled through the gallery, quickly silenced by Turner's sharp look. I find you guilty of deprivation of civil rights under color of law, a federal felony punishable by up to 10 years in prison. With each count, Morales seemed to shrink, as if the charges themselves were physically pressing him into the defendant's chair. And finally, Dana said, I find you guilty of perjury in the first degree for the knowingly false statements you made under oath in this courtroom. She let the list hang in the air, a brutal inventory of everything he'd tried and failed to hide. But understand this, Officer Morales, she added, this proceeding was never only about you. You are a single glaring symptom of a much deeper sickness in our justice system. Her gaze swept the room. For far too long, Dana said, we've allowed officers to act with near impunity. We've shrugged off complaints, buried video, written checks to make problems disappear, all while telling victims their experiences didn't count, that their word meant nothing next to a uniform. Her voice rose. For far too long, we have pretended these abuses are rare exceptions instead of predictable outcomes. She slammed her palm lightly on the bench. That pretense ends today, right here, in this courtroom. What happened here proves a fundamental truth, she continued. No one, and I mean no one, is above the law. Not officers, not prosecutors, not judges, not politicians. No one. On cue, Morales broke down completely, shoulders shaking with ugly, uncontrolled sobs that echoed through the hushed room. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I never meant. His words trailed off into ragged breaths, his remorse arriving only now that consequences were unavoidable. Dana regarded him with something like sorrow, but not surprise. Your apology is 15 years and 47 complaints too late, Officer Morales, she said softly. Your sudden regret appears only because you finally harmed someone who could hold you accountable. She lifted the gavel high above her head. But before I impose sentence, there's one more thing you need to understand. Something I want you to carry with you into every day of your life, from this point forward. In these last moments of your freedom, Dana said, I want you to remember that every person you humiliated or brutalized deserved exactly the justice you're receiving today. Her voice filled the room. Every grandmother you cursed, every teenager you framed, every professional you dragged from their own property, they all deserve to see you sitting in that chair hearing the word guilty. The gavel hovered. Today, I'm not just sentencing you for what you did to me. I am delivering judgment on behalf of every person whose complaint was dismissed as unsubstantiated, Dana said. Every family who watched their loved one roughed up or locked away while the system looked the other direction. Her tone sharpened. You told me this morning to know my place. Let me be absolutely clear. My place is making sure bullies like you can never again hide behind a badge while wrecking lives. The gavel came down with a resounding crack. Young Officer Blake Morales, she said, I hereby sentence you to the maximum penalty allowed by law. You will serve 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Morales sagged in his chair as if his bones had turned to water, sobs racking his body. Dana didn't look away. Furthermore, she continued, this court is ordering a comprehensive federal review of every case you've touched, every arrest you've made, and every complaint ever filed with your name attached. The people you silenced for 15 years, she said, will finally get their day in court. She set the gavel down and looked out over the assembled crowd. Let this serve as a message to every law enforcement officer, every prosecutor, every official who believes they can twist their power without consequences. Justice may be blindfolded, but she is not asleep. She sees, she remembers, and sooner or later, she knocks on every door. A long, stunned silence followed. Then, the courtroom erupted. Applause crashed over the benches, rolling for what felt like forever. And Turner didn't bother trying to quiet it. Even Porter allowed herself a single sharp clap. 6 months later, the aftershocks of that morning were still reshaping the justice system. Morales sat in a federal penitentiary, serving his 25-year sentence under protective custody. The man who'd strutted through neighborhoods like a conqueror now spent his days watching doors lock from the wrong side. His badge was gone, his pension forfeited, his gun turned in and tagged as evidence. The community he'd terrorized knew exactly where he was. Inside prison walls, word of his crimes had spread fast. Inmates recognized his name from old arrest reports and news footage. The man who'd once dictated other people's fates now lived under constant watch, finally understanding what it meant to feel small, outnumbered, and utterly powerless in a system he could no longer control. But Morales' downfall was only the first domino. The federal investigation Judge Walker ordered tore through the department's upper ranks like a storm. Auditors and civil rights attorneys dug through old files, body cam archives, and complaint logs. Within months, 12 officers had been fired outright, stripped of badges and benefits. 4 supervisors, 2 lieutenants, a captain, and a deputy chief faced criminal charges for conspiracy, cover-ups, and falsifying reports designed to protect high-performing officers like Morales. The entire department was placed under a sweeping federal consent decree. New policies mandated automatic external review for every serious use of force incident. Body cameras became non-negotiable, with redundant backup systems that couldn't be switched off or conveniently malfunctioned without leaving a digital trail. Chief Judge Porter instituted protocols requiring immediate preservation of evidence whenever any courthouse employee alleged misconduct. For the first time, officers learned that failing to document an encounter could end their careers as surely as brutality itself. Most importantly, the 432 cases Morales had contaminated were reopened. Prosecutors combed through transcripts and videos. Defense attorneys filed motions that had once seemed hopeless. Dozens of people, some still incarcerated, others living under the shadow of felony records, were exonerated and walked free. Hundreds more saw their charges dropped or sentences reduced. The county approved an additional $8.7 million in compensation to Morales' victims, drawn straight from the police department's budget rather than general funds. Judge Walker became a national symbol of judicial backbone and integrity. Law schools across the country invited her to speak. She told the story of how one morning's violence had exposed decades of systemic rot, but she never framed herself as the hero. The cameras were the witnesses, she'd say. The law was the weapon. I was just the person positioned to swing it. Her message remained consistent. Justice delayed is justice denied, but justice delivered can reshape an entire system. The courthouse where everything unfolded was officially renamed the Justice Walker Federal Courthouse. A bronze plaque near the entrance marked the exact spot where Morales had assaulted her. Its inscription was simple. Here on this staircase, justice finally spoke for those who had not been heard. Visitors paused to read it, some in tears, some taking pictures, all understanding that the building stood for something more than marble and oak now. It represented a turning point. Perhaps the most profound change happened beyond the building's walls. Residents who'd once avoided filing complaints began stepping forward. They attended public forums, told stories that had been buried for years, and demanded better. Community oversight boards, previously toothless or non-existent, gained real authority to review incidents and recommend discipline. Police training was rebuilt from the ground up, with Dana personally helping design courses on constitutional policing, implicit bias, and the true meaning of protect and serve. The young law clerk who'd watched everything unfold from the back row, Emily Chen, changed the trajectory of her career. Inspired by Judge Walker's courage, she chose to specialize in civil rights litigation. Within a few years, she was working for the ACLU, bringing cases against departments with eerily similar patterns of abuse. Rodriguez and Thompson, the officers who laughed while Morales assaulted Dana and then lied about it, were fired, indicted for obstruction and conspiracy, and later convicted on federal charges. Audio of their laughter, captured on Thompson's body cam, became required viewing at academies nationwide. In training sessions, instructors paused the video right before Morales threw Dana against the wall and asked recruits a simple question: what would you do right here? Their answers often determined who stayed in the program. The footage of Judge Walker delivering her verdict went viral, becoming the most watched courtroom clip on the internet, shared millions of times across platforms, languages, and countries. Viewers around the world flooded comment sections with their own stories. Traffic stops gone wrong, relatives beaten, complaints ignored. For many, Dana's fierce, measured words were the first time they'd seen a powerful institution publicly acknowledge what they'd been shouting into the void for years. "This gave me hope," one comment read. "For once, the system listened." Dana never responded online. She didn't need to. The ruling itself was her answer, and the reforms were her ongoing conversation. Now Officer Blake Morales spends his days in a narrow cell, replaying the moment he chose to treat a woman he didn't recognize as disposable. He thought he understood his place in the world. Untouchable, feared, protected. He thought he knew hers, silenced, powerless, beneath him. He'd been catastrophically wrong on both counts. Because sometimes justice doesn't just sit quietly behind a bench. Sometimes she stands up, pulls on her robes, and looks her accusers straight in the eye. Sometimes justice carries a gavel instead of a gun. Sometimes, when the timing and the evidence finally align, justice swings back harder than anyone expected. Never underestimate what can happen when someone refuses to stay quiet in the face of abuse, especially when that someone understands the law better than her attacker ever will. Share stories like this if you believe accountability shouldn't depend on who you are, what you look like, or what title appears under your name. Hit that like button if you want more real accounts of courage standing up to corruption, and subscribe if you believe these stories shouldn't be buried. They should be amplified. Somewhere out there, another person is sitting in a courtroom wondering if anyone will believe them over a badge. They need proof that justice can still show up, still fight, still win. They need to know that what happened here wasn't an anomaly. It was a blueprint. Because in the end, truth has a stubborn way of clawing its way to the surface. It lives in backup servers and forgotten recordings, in old complaint files in communities that refuse to be quiet any longer. It lives in judges willing to risk backlash and officers willing to break the silence. And eventually, when the moment is right and the evidence is ready, truth walks into court, takes the witness stand, and refuses to sit back down. Your story might not involve viral videos or renamed courthouses. It might start with something as simple as saying, "That's not okay," when everyone else looks away. But make no mistake, every time somebody stands up to power used wrongly, the ground shifts a little. That's how systems change. Not all at once, but case by case, voice by voice. And somewhere, justice is listening, waiting for the next chance to speak through someone brave enough to fight. So if you've ever felt small in the face of a badge, a robe, or a title, remember Judge Dana Walker. Remember the morning she walked toward work like any other day and ended up exposing an entire rotten structure to the light. Remember that power isn't always where it appears to be. Sometimes it's sitting quietly in a jumpsuit, taking notes, waiting for the exact right moment to stand and say, "Now let's tell the truth." And if you're wearing a badge, holding a public office, or wielding authority in any form, remember Blake Morales. Remember what happens when arrogance, prejudice, and unchecked power collide on camera. Remember that the system that shields you today might be the same one that turns and exposes you tomorrow. Most of all, remember the words etched on Dana's gavel. Justice is blind, but she sees. She saw him, and sooner or later, she sees everyone. Sometimes justice looks like a thick file full of complaints that finally get taken seriously. Sometimes it looks like an exhausted public defender doing his best for a client who's gone too far, or a young clerk deciding to dedicate her career to civil rights. Sometimes it looks like a community refusing to be gaslit anymore. However it appears, one thing remains constant. Justice doesn't vanish just because powerful people pretend she isn't there. She waits. She watches. And when the cameras roll, when the lies unravel, when the right person is sitting behind the right bench at the right time, she steps forward. If you're still here, still reading, still feeling that mix of anger and hope in your chest, don't ignore it. Channel it. Talk about these stories. Demand better. Document everything. Because the next time justice hits back, it might be in your city, your courthouse, your timeline. And you might be part of it. So share this. If you believe in real accountability, not the kind that lives only in press conferences and polished statements, but the kind that shows up in sentencing orders and released inmates and dismantled corrupt units. Like this video, if you think no one should be untouchable just because they wear a uniform or sit behind a big desk. Subscribe if you're ready to hear more about ordinary people refusing to bow to systems that were supposed to protect them. Because stories like Judge Walker's don't just belong on screens. They belong in classrooms, training academies, dinner tables, and city council meetings. They remind us that while institutions can fail, individuals inside them can still choose courage. They can still say, "Not this time, not in my courtroom, not in my city." And once enough people say it, the system has to listen, or be dragged kicking and screaming into the light. Either way, justice moves forward. Your story could be the next one someone else needs to hear. Maybe you're the person with the camera, the one with the complaint, the one in the jury box who refuses to rubber stamp a lie. Maybe you're the judge who finally says, "No more." Whoever you are, remember, silence protects abusers, not victims. And silence is one thing you never owe to anyone who misuses their power against you or your community. So stand up, speak out, document, demand. Share this story if you believe everyone deserves justice, no matter their skin color, income, or title. Hit like if you refuse to let fear have the last word. Subscribe if you're ready for more stories where courage beats corruption, even when the odds look impossible. Because truth has a way of breaking through eventually. And when it does, it doesn't whisper. It walks into court, raises a gavel, and changes everything. Justice is never too late. For those of us past 65, Judge Walker's story reminds us of something we've seen our whole lives. Power can go bad, but it can also be forced to answer. When truth is recorded, spoken out loud, and backed by courage, even an untouchable badge can fall. After hearing how Judge Walker turned one brutal morning into a turning point for a whole community, what does her fight for accountability stir up in your own memories or beliefs? Share your thoughts below, tap like, and subscribe so we can keep learning from stories like this together.